Alright, ladies and gentlemen, we are back to more Kerbals, and in this adventure we will start our final processes to put everything we need to put on Eve. Well, on Eve. Welcome back to the Eve Payload. According to the episode a couple episodes ago, I believe, you guys voted on whether or not to actually land Kerbals on the surface of the purple planet. The people have spoken, and it seems as though the majority of people want me to put at least one Kerbal on the planet, which is precisely what I'm going to do. And so, we have recruited a brand new character, Munberry Kerman, who will be joining us on our adventures. I have placed him in one of these rovers, the idea being that one of these rovers is going to be unmanned, but the other one will be manned by none other than the man, Munberry. And he'll be able to do crew reports, explore. So that'll be a blast, and then we'll have to figure out some way to get him back home. I have a couple of ideas, but they're gonna be a pretty cost-worthy adventure. Speaking of cost-worthy, these big rockets that I've been building lately have been kind of murder on my computer. So you may notice that there's a little bit of a quality reduction on my videos. I'm not sure if it's really obvious considering the size of the YouTube video screen, but if there is any issue with that, I'm sorry, and I'll try to fix it if it does become a serious problem. Okay, so let's give it a moment here. I'm going to click the T button, as usual. Before we launch, because I have a Kerbal in one of these rovers, it thinks that I want to control it from that system, and my nav ball down there is going to be screwed up a bit. So I'm going to click this upper lighthouse module right here and click the control from here button. Now my nav ball will rightly align itself so that it's centered rather than off to the side, which is going to be important for actually being able to control the craft. I want my gears to be down, I want my lights to be on. Going to keep an eye on my fuel gauge here. And that being said, let us make sure that we're throttled a little bit down, because our solid rocket boosters are going to be carrying us the first way there. So let us begin our first launch, or rather our final launch for a while, to Eve. Let's go. 3, 2, 1, ignition. Wow, I can even afford to throttle down a bit, I think. As much work, I would rather have these solid rocket fuel boosters do as much of the work here initially as possible, because that way we get to save more fuel for actually getting to Eve itself. Every little bit counts, and I think this design is just barely capable of making it to Eve. In fact, I'm going to throttle down a little bit more too, see if that helps at all. I believe these side rockets are actually going to run out before the solid rocket fuel boosters, which is kind of amusing. We should have the ability to compensate for that, though. Any moment now, those side boosters are going to go right away, and then we may have to throttle up a little bit to compensate for that lost boost, because we're not boosting that much right now. There we go. Oh, well, not really. We can keep going at this ordinary speed. We're not even a third of our boost upwards, really, and we can keep going at this rate. Fortunately, this system is not quite as heavy as Charon is, so in theory, it should take less fuel to actually get us all the way to Eve. The problem is that there's no upper stages beyond the main tank right here, so I'm kind of gambling. There we go. Now we have to throttle up a bit, I think. If only because of the fact that those boosters are providing most of the thrust. I notice, actually, oh my gosh, this is pretty, actually. I don't think I've ever shown this on camera before, but our mod pack allows us to have clouds in the game. It sort of feels like we're on a plane, actually, the way these clouds go up. It reminds me of being in a plane, which we may need to build someday, just for fun. At any rate, so far we're still doing rather well. I'm going to start turning to the east at this stage because we're hitting our usual quota for traveling at the right speed at the right distance to start to turn to commit to a solid orbit. Let's see how well this goes. Yep, we're going to have to ditch these thrusters. There we go, and throttle up a little bit. Let's just go it up to 2/3 the maximum. As long as this number is still climbing up, we should still be in good shape. But if it's not, we're going to have to tilt a little bit more vertically. Oh, yep, still going up. We're still in good shape. So I'm going to maintain our current position here and more or less keep things going from here. Okay, there we go. We have attained orbit with our Eve payload, so we can at least ensure that it won't come crashing down. Now, as I said, there are some things we can do to improve the capabilities of our rocket. And fortunately, the way we've designed this craft, we have a lot of spare fuel tanks that won't be needing their fuel at all. The lighthouse system up here that we tried flying around Eve earlier, or rather Kerbin, it can't fly at Eve, so there's no point in keeping fuel in it. So instead of using these fuel tanks as, well, fuel tanks, we'll be using them as structural elements instead. And we can utilize the fuel that's in them to pour them into the main tank where they're a bit more needed. Now, is this the most efficient way to do this? Oh, probably not. I probably could have made the entire vessel lighter just by having them be like fuselage pieces. I'm not sure if it's more efficient to have fuselage pieces or just have these fuel tanks that can be expended. I'm not quite sure, actually. Maybe some of you out there know, however. Let's see, I just want to make sure that I'm not accidentally clicking a decoupler or something. There we are. So, okay, admittedly not perfect, but I believe that we've got all of the fuel that we can get out of these other tanks expended properly. What may have also been smart is if I'd put thrusters on this thing instead and had these act like a second stage, but too little too late for that now, I suppose. So we'll just have to wing it as is. If anything goes wrong, we have a ton of monopropellant too, and we can probably use that to compensate for any slight variations. But as I said, there's no way this thing's going to be able to get back to Kerbal on its own once it's finished. Not that it's supposed to. All these pieces are going to land on Eve, and there's no way any of these heavy items are coming back from Eve. Anyway, so at this stage, we're probably just going to commit to our burn to get out into orbit around the Sun, and then from there, I'll set up an orbital point to get to Eve, or rather, I'll set a maneuver node to get to Eve. I believe there's a way to also be efficient in that leaving orbit while Eve is in the proper position relative to Kerbin can make it a more efficient launch. But I'm impatient, and I think it would take about a year or so for Eve to actually turn counterclockwise in its orbit to get to the position it needs to get into. Here we go. Not a big deal. Let's just burn now. We're basically just going to go full throttle here, get all the way out into the away from Kerbal, and then immediately let go of the throttle. If we throttle for too long after we achieve an escape from Kerbin, the problem is that our orbit might become erratic and shoot outward from the solar system instead of staying inward, or rather staying relatively close to Kerbin, which might make it a little bit more challenging to get to Eve in the first place. There we go. So, we have successfully escaped Kerbin. Simple. And unlike the Charon, which went on a direct route all the way to past Minmus and all the way out to Eve, we have chosen a simpler approach, which is to just do a flat-out trajectory away from Kerbin. Let's see, our solar panels are deployed, which means that we don't have to worry about losing electricity. So let's just watch the flow. Munberry, the first interplanetary traveler who will be landing on another planet. He is the first of many Kerbin, although I think the only one we're going to actually put on Eve itself, but the first of many Kerbin to go on excursions that will land on other surfaces, or rather surfaces away from the Kerbin system. Interestingly enough, the Eve payload and the Charon seem to be about neck and neck in terms of their race, although in the race to reach Eve, that is, even though we launched Charon earlier. And the Eve payload is closer to the inner solar system, so I think it's actually possible that, despite the fact that we launched this later, it might actually arrive at Eve first. Welcome back, everybody, to more Kerbal Space Program. So, I've set up the maneuver nodes properly for each of our crafts, the Charon and the Eve payload. Hopefully doing the least amount of fuel burning as possible. The idea is that we're going to have to go around the sun almost once, and then burn when we hit this maneuver node and go forward until we hit Eve. If I understand it correctly, this is probably one of the least expensive ways to get there fuel-wise, but I'm not entirely sure. The problem is that the the planet Kerbal itself actually missed the opportunity to go to Eve at its most optimal time, so we have to go around the sun almost an entire year before we can do a proper launch. I've done the same sort of idea for the Charon, and interestingly enough, it looks like it's actually going to hit its maneuver node sooner by about nearly 40 days in advance. I'm still not entirely sure which one of them is going to arrive at Eve first, of course. Okie doke. Real quick, it is nearly time for Charon to perform its maneuver node, or hit its maneuver node rather, to get to Eve. Looks like Charon is so far winning the race to get to Eve because it's hitting its major maneuver node point first. But whether or not it'll actually get there first has yet to be seen. Today, we experiment and see what happens. To begin with, we first need to find out exactly how long we need to burn. Unfortunately, the estimated burn time is not quite appearing on screen. Based on my calculations, which is to say my estimations, which is to say my guess based on past performance, probably about, maybe a minute and a half or so. Just make sure that I can keep an eye on the timer right there. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Here we go. Okay, so my calculations are a little bit off, but hopefully that should allow us to get there at a relatively reasonable pace. Admittedly, I believe these fuel tanks might start to overheat if I let them burn for too long, so I am going to actually have to throttle down a little bit to make sure that doesn't happen. Let's see, this main tank should be doing fine. I don't think it's going to keep overheating, or at least not at the rate that I expect it to. So let us go over here. If we're really lucky, we won't even have to worry about losing our lower tank at the bottom there, and that would ensure a little bit more thrust as we approach the planet Eve right there. If it does break if we do run out of fuel in the main tank right there, we'll notice because our estimated burn time will suddenly spike upwards a bit. So if that does happen, we'll be ready to compensate for that, which is a very possible, possibility. 20 seconds to go. Hopefully we'll make it before that first fuel tank runs out. The good news is that at this point, if that tank does run out, we should have more than enough thrust to compensate in our main tank so that we wouldn't have to burn too much fuel anyway. Oh, look at that! Is this what we want? Hold on, let me quick save right now. Okay, I want to get that number as low as possible. Fortunately, the game seems to be cooperating with us. Okay, that's about as low as I'm going to get with this current maneuver node. So the good news is that we definitely made it with all of our main tanks. And I can even kill this node now. We can probably improve upon this number. Maybe, let's see, right now we're a little bit too high above the surface by the looks of things. We can compensate for that by doing some fine-tune adjustments later on. The point is that we made it. Let's check to see how much fuel we have here. Huh, oh look at that, we barely have enough to perform any extra maneuver that we want to do to try to improve our angle here. Let's see, what could be done from this vantage point? Okay, there we are. With a little bit of fine-tuning, we have put ourselves in 79 kilometers, which technically would put us in the atmosphere of the planet, which we can fine-tune, but fortunately that's precisely the trajectory that we want to actually arrive in the Eve sphere of influence. Now, all I need to do is add a new alarm. We don't have to do this, by the way. This is a mod that I'm using, by the way, called the Kerbal Alarm Clock. But according to the data here, it looks like we'll actually arrive at Eve itself in about 112 days. So far it looks like it's doing pretty good. Let's go check up on the payload that's carrying the ships that'll actually land on Eve itself. Yep, here we go. First of all, I am not entirely sure how much fuel we'll actually have to burn to put ourselves in here. We're carrying less fuel than the Charon did, or rather, when it arrived at its burn point. But the positive news is that this is a lighter load, so we might not have to burn as long to get to Eve. We might even be able to keep our fuel tank here. We'll have to see. Oh, not bad. Interesting. Let's see, can we improve upon this? Indeed we can. Not bad. How much fuel do we have left in here? A fair amount! Not bad, I think that's a bit more than what Charon had, actually. But on the other hand, we don't have any extra stages to carry with us, so once this fuel's expended, we're basically set in its own path here. But again, we can improve upon this. Okay, and there we have it, everybody. That maneuver node is all set to go, so going at the trajectory that we're going at right now, we will approach Eve in, let's see, according to this point right here, about 100 days, which means that Charon will actually arrive there first, because I believe it had a bit more boosting power behind it and it had a head start. So, we will, of course, prepare ourselves for that. It's only a little bit of time left before we actually arrive. The Charon looks like it's going to win the race, but the Charon has a more specific target to reach, which is Gilly, which is Eve's moon, whereas the Eve payload simply has to orbit around. So while the Eve payload has a little bit longer to get there, its maneuvers to actually stay where it's supposed to stay are going to be a bit easier. You'll see shortly. Until then, everybody, this is Ardwick. Stay tuned, and good night.